Hello, welcome back. This is part 2, thinking about Jeanette Winterson's experiments. So in part 1, we were talking about kind of an introduction to her writing, in particular thinking about this idea of a cycle and the way in which she developed themes through those 7 novels between Oranges and Not the Only Fruit, all the way then to the PowerBook. I think it's useful to reflect on how she sees herself as a writer, and a very useful collection for that is her text Art Objects, which was published in the mid-1990s. It's a series of essays that look at her writing, that talk as well actually about her gender and her sexuality. Winterson has been somebody who has been labelled, if you like, a lesbian writer, and that's certainly her sexual orientation. But she's somebody who sees herself first and foremost as a writer, and actually subtly plays with those ideas of sexuality in her novels. For example, is Ali/Alex female? Is he male? It appears to me that what might be considered a non-gendered narrator to begin the text actually is gendered differently at different points during that novel. She's somebody who very clearly identifies herself as a modernist, somebody in the modernist tradition. For those of you who've maybe looked at ideas of modernism, maybe studying literature of the 20th century, you'll be aware that modernists were very keen to kind of break from tradition, to distance themselves, to experiment and find new ways of articulating and new ways of kind of representing narrative. So she identifies writers like T.S. Eliot, like James Joyce, in particular Virginia Woolf. If you know the text Orlando, perhaps you studied literary theory and the philosophy of literature and have looked at that text in particular. She sees herself as the kind of inheritor of Virginia Woolf's ideas of a kind of an androgynous narrative. And it's difficult, like I say, to pin down in a number of her novels, perhaps starting with texts like The Passion and Sex in the Cherry, to figure out if you're talking about a female or a male narrator. And she really extends this idea in Written on the Body. So if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to talk to you kind of more about it. I think for the purposes of our explorations today, I think it's really important to see the way in which she constructs herself as a writer. So before it became fashionable to think about modernism in other ways, Winterson was already saying that she was not a postmodernist. She dislikes the tricksiness, the textuality of postmodernism. And there's a lovely quotation from her text Art Objects here, which I think is a great kind of summation of her humour as a writer as well. So she's sort of saying that we need to get beyond these kind of literary categorisations, that if we're not careful, theory will entirely fence us in with posts. And you'll be aware already in this module that the way in which we think about those kind of literary categories has a number of posts. Are we beyond modernism? Are we beyond kind of postmodernism? And for me, she's a writer who just kind of cuts through all that and says, well, actually, you know, who cares? It's important to talk about humanity. It's important to talk about the essential human truths, which she sees as love and desire. And the boundaries that kind of get in the way of that. So a constant refrain through her writing is boundaries and desire, and that's something that we see again in this novel. So Winterson has, in this cycle of novels, really kind of riffed on the idea of cover versions. So in her novel Wait, which is the later text, she comes back to this idea that actually she was in that instance commissioned to write for Canongate a version of Atlas, the story of Atlas holding up the world, and she said, actually, I realise I want to tell the story again. The cycle of novels has ended, but actually I'm still interested in the same concerns. And really, if we kind of think about what it is she's interested in, she's interested in herself both as object and subject of her work. But more than that, this isn't a straight autobiography. This is a writer who's thinking of herself as artist. So she uses the example at the end of the novel of the PowerBook. She uses this idea of Rembrandt and to say, here is an artist who never more so than anyone else put himself first and foremost, as self-portraiture, at the centre of his art. And that's what she's looking to do. So I'm interested in the ways that she moves through these different kind of categories. She is both author and reader. She is a rereader, a rewriter of these different texts. And one of the significant texts that keeps replaying through these novels is a foundation story. It's a story of autobiography, or as she puts it repeatedly in her work, autobiography, art and lies. Art and lies. In the PowerBook, there's a couple of sections, but if you've got my edition, if you turn to page 137, and it would be worth just having a look at that. There's a kind of an interlude, a section that takes us to the muck heap, the muck pile. So you could do something really quite interesting, I think, about kind of exploring how she sees this kind of cosmic dustbin. This is almost like going back to kind of Samuel Beckett's play and kind of lifting the dustbin lid off this kind of character. Here you have Mr. and Mrs. Muck entirely in their own world, but who need an orphan, who need a foundling as a way of kind of seeing outside. But unfortunately for Mr. and Mrs. Muck, they don't recognise love. They don't recognise love in language. They don't recognise love as a storytelling kind of mechanism. So they're unable to see the treasure that is all around them. And again, Alex, as this character, Alex, then becomes this mechanism for us to understand that Mr. and Mrs. Muck live in a dustbin and they can't see beyond their own nose. Now that's a story that fits very well if you've read any of her other work. It's a retelling of Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. It's actually a retelling as well of a story she tells in her children's book, Entangle Wreck. It's a story she returns to again in Lighthouse Keeping, where again you have kind of an orphan, Silver, who's the kind of the storyteller that leads you out on these various stories. And she returns to it again in Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal. So for those of you who are interested in sort of theoretical readings, and in particular contemporary theoretical readings of authors' work, you can see this compulsion to return as being almost a kind of a traumatic memory, that Winterson is actually unable to write herself out of her own history and is ultimately caught in this loop, forever reimagining, forever re-returning to this beginning. So it's a really interesting and kind of contemporary way into thinking about her work. Okay, moving on a little bit then to think about her as a kind of a contemporary writer, a contemporary critic again. She's somebody, like I said, who is very concerned with the kind of the transformation of the novel. So going back to those kind of modernist writers who were kind of reinvigorating the novel at the beginning of the 20th century, she traces a lineage for herself through European writers, people like Calvino, the Italian writer, people like Georges Perec as well, who are doing some very interesting things in the kind of the mid-century, at a point at which, if you're studying literature of the 20th century, you'll see that a lot of the games playing maybe in kind of modernism, the way in which modernism becomes attenuated in the mid part of the century, those experimentations are still carrying on the continent. She says something wonderful along the lines of, there's nothing to interest me in the 20th century in British literature between the publication of Orlando and the publication of Angela Carter's The Magic Toy Shop, when you have this kind of magical realist reinvigoration of literature in the 1970s as it was then. So for Winterson, you can look at her journalism online, you can look at, like I say, at her essay collection. She's somebody who's wanting to think about this kind of forward momentum, so thinking about the ways in which, through new technology, we can find new ways of looking at old things. And the PowerBook is very much a kind of exploration of that. It's an exploration of new technology. Technology as being an enabler, an ability to kind of rethink the contemporary condition, which is not just contemporary, it's also building on obviously where we've come from. The PowerBook was also thinking about these kind of ideas of kind of cover versions. It was also reimagined, not adapted but reimagined, and staged in London, Paris, and also subsequently in Rome as well. So what is it she's doing in this novel? I think she's using this idea, this mechanism of virtual reality, a kind of a meat space and a cyberspace, as an opportunity to extend beyond identity. Winterson is someone a little bit like Salman Rushdie or Martin Amis, who's kind of come through literary studies in the 1980s. So she has experienced high levels of kind of literary theory, and that's really kind of informed, I think, the way in which she's thinking about identity. I think that, like Angela Carter before her, like Kathy Acker, she's really pushing at the boundaries of a third wave feminism, and also perhaps what we might consider now to be kind of trans studies, this ability to kind of reimagine yourself. And she certainly goes beyond actually a kind of a performative sense of identity. I think it's not just about, as it was in her novel The Passion, dressing up and being clothed as a different identity. It's this opportunity to shed a body, to be embodied in a different way, whether that be male, whether that be female. And going forward, she starts to think in a kind of a post-human sense about robotics, in Stone Gods, and about AI in particular as well. So I just want to say a little bit about her politics. So I spent a long time, I think, on this PowerPoint before I've actually talked about her as a lesbian writer. And I think for Winterson, she's somebody who first and foremost is a writer, and it's important that she chooses the labels that she's associated with. And that's led to a certain amount of criticism. You may have come across Elaine Shellwater, a very famous, upstanding kind of critic in English literature circles, perhaps more of a second wave kind of feminist than kind of third wave, who criticises Winterson for not taking on the kind of the big contemporary question. She says that Winterson is apolitical. She's not interested in reform for lesbian identity. I'm not necessarily sure whether I agree with that. I think that Winterson is political, but I think that her politics are of a different type. I think that she's interested in textual politics. She's interested in those kind of experimentations. And what I think's going on in the PowerBook is that you have a series of kind of experiments that are kind of masking a real contemporary focus, actually, that we've seen coming through in 1990s literature in particular, a kind of strange period, potentially, a strange period that we're considering here on this module of kind of contemporary fiction. Perhaps where the games playing and the tricksiness of kind of postmodernism has led us to want to think about kind of traumatic memory, think about humanity, think about ideas perhaps of the post-human that get us to think about what it means to be human. And for somebody who's so interested in this force of love and this opportunity to kind of to heal, I think that her writing that was so criticised in the mid-90s is actually being recovered in some interesting ways now. So some of those new theories that I was kind of talking about, perhaps it might even be typified as kind of an ethical turn in thinking about kind of trauma and loss in those ways. So this feels like a natural pause to me now. I'm going to end this second segment here, and if you're interested in finding out more, please join me on the other side in segment 3.